The Southern Rhone has only the river in common to the Northern Rhone, and only are a few aspects. Vast majority of the region is flat, with really different aspects that come to play. The Cote du Rhone is the largest of the whole AOC. It covers almost 50% of the whole production. But nonetheless, it is an interesting region to explore and to discover. It has many different cogs that are joined together, many different terroirs, and the laddering system, the Cote du Rhone Village, and the Name Village. The Name Village are villages that, as my guest describes it, they are on the pathway to become a crew on their own rights, and they are becoming some of the most exciting part where to look for new producers and new regions in France. With its turbulent geographical past, the region really has many different aspects. It's quite a difficult region to get your hands around, but thankfully with my guest today, Matt Walls, who wrote the book The Wines of Rhone, is here to help us understand better this region and to discover it more. But if you enjoyed the podcast, remember to subscribe and to tell your friends. Now, on with the show. Hi, I'm Mattia Scarpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Welcome to the Looking Into Wine podcast. I'm Mattia Scarpazza, your host, and today we're talking about the Rhone region, and in particular the Cote du Rhone wines. The Cote du Rhone first came in fruition in 1937 and to receive its AOC status in 1966. In the region, Cote du Rhone historically was used to describe wine of good quality from less known villages of the Rhone Valley, but over the years, the villages and the various tiers and some of the styles have evolved. To help us understand the region and to answer our question, I welcome on the show my guest, the author of the book The Wines of Rhone, and the Decanter Regional Chair for Rhone Wines, Matt Walls. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Mattia. Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. I've seen your work for the Rhone region is over the past 10 years or and it's fantastic. Your book is really interesting, and you're really the voice for the Rhone wines in the UK. So when did you first came into getting to know the wines of Rhone? When was the love evolving?
Yeah, where did it come from? It's a funny one, really, because there was no one kind of sudden, there wasn't like one wine which turned me on to the wines of the Rhone, I don't think. I think, the wines of the Rhone in the UK, at least, it's one of those names which I think is kind of in everyone's consciousness when they begin to get to know about wine in general, a little bit like Bordeaux or Champagne. The Rhone is just one of these names which you're kind of generally a little bit aware of. I think my interest started to develop more and more, actually, when I started. I used to work for a UK importer, and we used to bring in the wines of Chapoutier, which is a very big company in the Rhone, so one of the big négociant houses. And when I started kind of working with those wines, getting to know those wines, they make so many different appellations across the whole of the Rhone, the north and the south. And I think that started to open my eyes a little bit to the qualities, the diversity, actually to the value as well, because I think, when you're starting out in wine, you don't have a load of money to spend necessarily, or certainly I didn't, I was quite young. And I could find, a lot of bang for my buck in the Rhone. And then on from there, I started tasting their top wines, the single vineyard wines, the sélection parcellaire, as they call them, particularly in Hermitage, Cote Rôtie, and then further Saint-Joseph, Creux-Hermitage. And then I began to see, quite what could be created in the Rhone and how amazing these wines could be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think as I asked the breadth of styles and the qualities in price point, as you mentioned it. So when it comes to the the Southern Rhone and the Cote du Rhone, because for me it's a little bit more difficult to understand than the Northern Rhone, because it's a narrower, it's a little bit smaller area to sort of get your hand around. How do you get around to understand the sort of mosaics of these soils, and how this all coming together in a small region, especially for like the Cote du Rhone, I think is such a diverse area. How do you make your head around there?
Well, it's tricky. I think you're absolutely right. The Northern Rhone is relatively easy to understand, right? It's quite a small area. It's the river. It runs north to south. The vineyards are quite close to the river, and you're broadly talking about granite. Right? It's pretty easy, really, to get your head around. But then, as the granite stops and the river starts to spread in the south, suddenly you have this like enormous, great big dog's dinner of terroir, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because the terroir there can be fantastic quality, but there's limestone here, then there's sand over there, and then there's layers of kind of clay limestone and then there's the dentelle de Montmirail, so you get these kind of mountainous terroir, and then you go down to Costières de Nîmes, and you get this maritime terroir. So it's huge, and I think this is the thing that's quite tricky to get your head around with the Southern Rhone. The Northern Rhone just makes 5% of the wine of the Rhone. 95% of the wine is made in the south. So I think what would be helpful, and I think what I've tried to do in my book a little bit actually, is to split up the Southern Rhone into different areas. So you can kind of refer to these different areas and try and get to know these kind of areas a little bit more separately, rather than trying to understand the whole of the Southern Rhone in one go. And I think once you get to know these smaller areas, for example, the mountainous terroir of the Dentelle is one quite kind of discrete area. There's the Kiran-Rasto Hills, which are another kind of discrete area. And I think if you can get to know these separate bits, then you can piece them together like a puzzle.
Yeah, and obviously, when talking about when you mentioned the influence of the mountain, the dentelles, that sort of change also the microclimate and everything. If you were to sort of think of like two opposite style and for the mountain area, two villages of the Cote du Rhone, to opposite style to explore the region, where would you sort of look at to see the difference in the styles produced?
I think the most useful way to do that would probably to do it along terroir lines. So not necessarily just stylistic lines. Sorry. So I think you're right to talk about the dentelle, because you get this mountainous terroir, you get the elevation, you get the altitude, so you get the freshness from that. Obviously, the further up you go in terms of altitude, the lower the temperatures. You get more of a difference between day and night temperatures, which again brings this sense of aromatic freshness. So I would probably look at Gigondas, because a lot of their terroir is very high, up to about 500 meters altitude. So I would look at Gigondas as one particular style, particularly the high altitude of Gigondas, because some of it isn't. Some of it is kind of lower down. It's not necessarily a worse terroir, it just gives a slightly different expression. So yeah, I would look kind of up in the hills of Gigondas to find that kind of one style of fresher style of Southern Rhone. And as an interesting style to compare, I think Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It's often these villages are kind of lumped together. I think when people are kind of talking about the Southern Rhone, they talk about Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Gigondas, Vacqueyras, but actually the terroir is completely different. So in Gigondas, you get these kind of these high altitude vineyards among these kind of jagged limestone hills. Châteauneuf-du-Pape much lower down, closer to the river, and it's actually quite a kind of undulating, reasonably kind of almost monocultural terroir these days. There's so much vineyard there. Obviously, there's kind of small areas of woodland as well, but it's flatter, it's lower down, so lower altitude, and it's naturally just a very hot terroir. And I think you get this natural power from this area. And it's not always easy to explain exactly why. I mean, the soils are different for a start. So you get a lot of these kind of galets roulés, these kind of round stones, these pudding stones, which is very much like the emblematic soil type of the Southern Rhone. And I think these soils bring a lot of power to the wines. So I would compare the Galets Roulés soils of Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the high altitude wines of Gigondas to get a feel a little bit for what these different terroirs can bring to very similar grape varieties.
And talking of grape varieties, especially in the Southern Rhone, there's a myriad of them. There's
Endless.
there's quite an endless amount of grape varieties, and but the key grape variety is Grenache for the region. But what are you seeing in other part of the Rhone? Outside of like the Gigondas or the most famous for Grenache based wines, where are you seeing a new grape variety being used? What is getting excited there for the red wines? And then we can have a little chat about the whites, because I think they're really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in terms of the red, the funny thing is actually, in many ways, okay, so Grenache is still the king of the Southern Rhone, the most widely planted grape. Very widely planted in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, maybe 75 to 80% of plantings of red varieties are Grenache. But Châteauneuf-du-Pape, because of the appellation rules, they're quite different to the rest of the Southern Rhone. They were the first appellation in France, one day before the other kind of five kind of first wine appellations of France. And but because of their rules, they can actually plant whatever they like. So if they want to make a pure Syrah Châteauneuf-du-Pape, they can. If they want to make a pure Grenache, they can. If they want to make a pure Cunoise, a pure Vacquerez, and some people have, they can. So they have real freedom in terms of what they do with their grape varieties in Châteauneuf. And I think because of that, we're seeing a growing interest in some of these more unusual kind of heritage varieties, or kind of more unusual local varieties like Vacquerez. And I think a lot of that is actually coming from this most traditional original appellation of Châteauneuf. So Vacquerez, I think, is one interesting grape variety that we're seeing a little bit more of, a little bit more interesting. Also Cunoise, another grape variety. You see these two virtually nowhere else in the world. You see a little bit of Cunoise in California, actually. And they make a variety of different styles there. But it originally comes from southern France. And what Cunoise does actually is really useful. So it ripens quite late, but it ripens at reasonably low alcohols and has quite a nice sense of freshness and fluidity and reasonable acidity. So it's very useful in the blend. So Grenache, as we know, can kind of build up quite a lot of sugar, which obviously converts to alcohol. So you get quite alcoholic wines, particularly in hot vintages. So blending in things like Vacquerez, things like Cunoise, these local varieties, which are very well adapted to the terroir, they can help bring down the alcohol a little bit in the overall blend. But they're very interesting in their own right.
And are you seeing these being brought up into the other, so the peripheral area of the Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the Cote du Rhone as well? Are you start seeing some movement there and because obviously in appellation wise, the Cote du Rhone, there has to be a blend of the wines. They can't do single varietals. How are they getting around with the planting and everything? Or are they still using 100% mostly Grenache in the planting then?
Yes, sure. So as you say, if it's appellation Cote Du Rhone or Cote Du Rhone Village, has to be a blend, has to include Grenache in the Southern Rhone, and has to also include either Syrah and or Mourvèdre. But again, as you were saying, they have this whole great big smorgasbord of other varieties to choose from. So if they want to, they can include Vacquerez, they can include Cunoise. They can also include some white varieties in their reds if they want to, which can be useful in the blend again. So if you're planting some things like a little bit of Picpoul, perhaps a little bit of Picardin, something like that. So, or even Claret. So some of these white varieties with kind of moderate or slightly higher acidity, that can bring a bit of acidity to the blend. It can help alcohol down a little bit again. Blending is very much at the heart of the Southern Rhone. So I think kind of using this huge variety of different grape varieties, almost like a kind of painter would kind of pick different kind of accents for a painting that he was working on. So they get the ability to do that, which is great actually, because it gives the winemakers more space to experiment. Means they can be a little bit more creative. Means that they can react to challenges that they might be facing, like climate change as well.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the effect of climate change and the usage of different blending material, let's say, for balancing the wine and creating the style of persistent style. How is affecting the region, the Southern Rhone, the climate change? Where are you seeing the changes happening in there in the region? Because every region seems to have a slightly different problems or different occurrences happening to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're still at a stage currently where climate change isn't always a bad thing for every particular region right now. So, for example, in Ventoux, some of the higher altitude terroirs, some of the kind of more north-facing terroirs, they didn't reliably ripen red varieties, particularly red varieties like Mourvèdre, which take a little bit more sun, a little bit more heat. So now we're seeing better wines, more full-bodied, more powerful, and actually better balanced wines coming from these higher altitude terroirs, such as Ventoux, which is great now, may not be great in 20 years' time if things continue in the direction they are going, which is likely to happen. But at least for now, we are seeing some kind of positive changes in certain areas. Other areas, certainly lower down, so some of the lowest terroirs, the hottest terroirs, the ones which are most open to the sun, obviously less good for these areas. We're seeing, I guess, slightly higher alcohols, slightly occasionally some sunburning on the grapes. We are seeing problems along these lines, kind of baked flavors, jammy flavors in certain wines, which isn't always so
Yeah,
positive.
well, but what about rainfall? So rain has, I imagine that the Rhone is been quite a dry area historically, or quite Mediterranean. Is there any change in the rain patterns? Is it less raining coming into the region? Or on top of your head, and just
It's the funny thing about the rain that is we're not necessarily seeing less rain in certain vintages. Yes, certain vintages recently have been very dry, but it's more of a case of the rainfall patterns have become more chaotic. So instead of us seeing kind of regular rain, small rains throughout the year, which is kind of what you want, particularly in the summer, you want some regular rains just to kind of aid ripening, keep things moving along. We're seeing very, very dry summers, but then we're seeing big storms in the autumn, sometimes in the spring, but kind of quite wet winters as well. But often in the autumn, loads and loads of rain coming in. So this is, it's not great. But for certain terroirs, water-retaining terroirs, more like clay terroirs, these are better at retaining water. And if these rains do come, they can replenish the water table a little bit. So particularly for old vines, they can draw on this during the season to come. For young vines, not so good. Some vintages, as I was saying, we're also seeing, we're not seeing those storms.
This year I expect it to be quite dry here. I mean, it's been throughout Europe a quite dry vintage.
Yeah.
How was the vintage 2022 compared to the last 4 or 5 vintages? So how would you rate? How would you think it is, and what vintage are you actually looking at?
I don't have much experience with the 2022 vintage. I mean, it's only just been picked. It's kind of still in tank. What I hear is that people are generally very positive. It was very dry, as we were saying, throughout the season, but there were quite a few, not huge, but good rains around just before vintage, kind of positive, helpful rains. So which helped kind of unblock maturity, move things along, add a little bit of juice. So it's looking like it could be a good vintage. The one that I have just been tasting is 2021. Not such a good vintage. And you never really want to have to say to people, it wasn't a great vintage. You never want to kind of have to be negative. But at the end of the day, I've got to be truthful, and it's not as good as most of the recent vintages going back to, 15 was good, 16 was great, 17 was good, 18, not brilliant. There was a lot of mildew in the Southern Rhone. But there nonetheless are some very good wines. 19, brilliant. 20, very, very good indeed. 21, frost. Like the whole of France hit badly by the frost, so things got off to a late start. A lot of shoots, kind of early shoots, were killed actually, so a lot of people lost a lot of their crop. And then kind of things got off to a very kind of wet start, and because of the frost, there were secondary shoots which gave some fruit. You're not always going to perhaps get the same quality of fruit from these secondary shoots, and they're later, of course, and they never really caught up. So it turned out to be quite a late vintage. Then there was rain pressure during the vintage. People had to pick, they were worried about rot. So it's not such an exciting vintage 2021. However, it is brilliant for the whites. That is the silver
let's
line.
talk about the whites of the Southern Rhone and the Cote du Rhone. I think it's a really exciting area there. I tried quite a few really exciting white wines from the region. What grape varieties are you? How do you look in the white wines of the Southern Rhone? Definitely different to the ones from the north. How do you?
Well, generally speaking, different grape varieties. So much more Grenache Blanc and Claret down in the south. There's a fair bit of Roussanne as well, which you see in the Northern Rhone, but it's a different expression. It's hotter in the south, of course. So Roussanne tends to be more big, more powerful, more rich, more full-bodied in the Southern Rhone than it is in the north. But nonetheless, actually can be very, very good. You see much less Marsanne in the south than the north. You do see a lot of Viognier in the Southern Rhone. However, of course, we're talking about blends again. So in the south, you're expecting there to be many more grapes kind of coming into the blend. In the north, okay, so people blend between Marsanne and Roussanne sometimes, but that's the extent of the blending. In the south, much freer, many more grapes to choose from. So Claret, for me, is a grape that I like a lot. So it's a grape that has a lot of aromatic freshness. It's quite a distinctive grape. It is reasonably full-bodied. It can sometimes perhaps get a little bit too full-bodied. The acidity, people often talk about the acidity of Claret. It's very fresh acidity. I don't think that's the case. Okay, so I've been tasting a lot of Clarets from all around the world, and it's not a high acid grape. It's a moderate acid. It has moderate acidity at best. But it gets this freshness from its aromatics, and it always seems to retain these kind of fresh floral, almost like kind of freshly washed linen sometimes, the aromas that you get. And often just it has this sense of freshness, but it's not derived from acidity. So Claret, I like a lot. Claret Rose. So that is a natural color mutation. So it's a darker berry version. And that tends to give even slightly more floral expression than Claret does. Relatively rare, but you do see a little bit, often in the blend. Other white grapes in the Southern Rhone. Again, we could go on for a long time talking about Picpoul, Picardin, and other things. But
yeah, what about the sort of the main grape, like Grenache Blanc? Is Grenache Blanc? How do you describe Grenache Blanc? Where and which areas of the Rhone, the Southern Rhone, you really get excited about tasting a Grenache Blanc from that particular area? Or yeah, which area do you?
I don't think there is necessarily any area in the Southern Rhone which excels at Grenache Blanc. It's the most widely planted white grape in the Southern Rhone. You find it everywhere. It is reasonably neutral. When you do get aromatics from Grenache Blanc, it tends to be along the kind of red apple, pear, those kind of orchard fruits. Sometimes it might start leaning towards a little bit of apricot, but it tends to be aromatically fairly neutral. It's full-bodied, it has a lot of richness, it has a lot of fat. It never sounds very nice in English when you talk about the fat of the grapes, but they call it gras, which is almost like this kind of silkiness and substance, I suppose. So you get a lot of that. It does, in certain terroirs, translate minerality quite well. So that is one of its benefits. And in many ways, it's the canvas, upon which you can use other grapes to build some interest. So you start with your Grenache Blanc, and then you can add some Roussanne, you can add some Claret, you can add a little bit of Picpoul, maybe a little bit of Grenache Grise, and Picardin, this, that, to kind of build and to blend a more interesting kind of picture of the terroir. You do get some nice Grenache Blancs from a village, one of the named villages called Vaison-la-Romaine. So Vaison-la-Romaine is, most of it is, part of it is, how do I describe this? So Queyran and Rasteau, two very famous appellations towards the fairly central to the Southern Rhone. But it's a hill. So Queyran is the west side of the hill, Rasteau is the east side of the hill, and we're talking about the southern face here, because most of their wines, if not all, are red. Now, the northern side of this hill never used to be very popular because, hard to ripen grapes on the northern side. There's a lot of wind, open to the Mistral northern wind, and other local air currents. So it was never particularly favoured, but actually it's pretty good for white wines. And they grow a lot of very good Grenache Blanc there that I like very much. So that's a good area. Where else would be good for Grenache Blanc? So Gigondas, they will soon be able to make their own white wines. So they'll soon be able to make AOC Gigondas Blanc. They are much more about Claret. So that's more of a kind of Claret specialised area. You find a lot of Grenache Blanc in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and I think, some of the expressions there can be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, so for the white, I think, as the way you're describing it, there is the Grenache Blanc is used as a canvas and then build on from there. And I was thinking that the interest for me of the Southern Rhone white is this like richness, but then there is a lot of elements coming from the other grapes, and it's really interesting. And when we're talking about the appellation earlier, you name a few appellation. I was thinking, how the Crew Village, how do sorry. How do you define the Crew Village? They seem to be quite fluid. They seem to be changing a lot in the last decade. What changes have you seen, and how they can be so fluid?
So the named villages. So it's, how do we describe this? So there are 22 of them, of these named villages. So it's the appellation is AOC Cote Du Rhone Village plus geographic name. So the way that this particular part of the appellation pyramid works. So just to kind of refresh our memories a little bit. So at the base of the pyramid, we have just the generic appellation AOC Cote du Rhone. So about 50% of wine, 50% of AOC wine in the Rhone is just this generic AOC Cote du Rhone. Then if you move up in quality, then you get the AOC Cote Du Rhone Village, which in theory is a step up in quality. The rules to make your wines are a little bit stricter. There are fewer grape varieties that you can use, yields a bit more restricted. And then as you move up in quality further still, then you get these 22 named villages. So it's AOC Cote Du Rhone Village plus geographic name. So you're right, it is a kind of slightly fluid category. So there are currently 22 villages, or at least kind of small terroirs, which can append their name to this appellation. So, for example, AOC Cote Du Rhone Village Chusclin, AOC Cote Du Rhone Village Sablé, or the most recent one, AOC Cote Du Rhone Village Niels. And in many ways, it's a kind of training ground for future crew. Okay, so when I'm talking about the crew, I'm talking about appellations, so villages or communes which have their own appellation. For example, AOC Gigondas, AOC Châteauneuf-du-Pape, AOC Vacqueyras. So these named villages, it's almost like they're kind of working towards trying to get their own kind of crew status. So what they're trying to do is basically they're trying to prove themselves. They're trying to show that the terroir that they're trying to express, whether that's one single village or whether that's a more complex kind of demarcated area of terroir. For example, Laudun, so which is one of the 22 named villages. So this is on the west bank of the Rhone. It is So it's been one of the named villages for decades now. So, you know, they've been plugging away at this for a long, long time. And it looks like that finally they may be given their own cru status. So they'll be elevated to AOC Loda, hopefully, probably from the 2023 vintage. And the interesting thing about Loda is that they've always been very famous for their white wines. Actually, throughout history, they've been very famous for their white wines. They make more white wine than any of the other 22 named villages. I think it's somewhere in the region of 17% white wine, which is a lot for the region. So I think on average, you know, I think that about 7 or 8% of Rhone appellation wine is white. So they make a lot of white wine. And so here they are on the west bank of the Rhone, and the west bank of the Rhone always seems to give wines with a little bit more straightness and freshness, a little bit more tense, which obviously plays into white wine production quite well. So yeah, it looks as if Lourdes are going to be promoted. So then we'll go down to 21 named villages until another one is kind of promoted into this group. So who that will be, who knows? I don't think there's anyone on the cards currently. But we'll
And
see.
how does a non-name village get to apply, or how do you get part of this 22 now?
Yeah, how do you do it?
How do you do that, or how do you join the club?
That's a good question. Often, historically, it was always like a village that used to do this. So often, you know, there are villages around which are quite well known or have always been well known for a particular style or a particular quality. So what would happen is that the winemakers in this village would club together and get together a little club called a syndicat, and they would work together, and they would I suppose what they would do is try to define their terroir, define the style of wine that they think their terroir makes, and to try and express this and to try and show to the appellation authorities that they do have a special terroir, that this makes a special type of wine, which has its own character. And then if the appellation authorities eventually agree, then they would be kind of elevated into this group of the named villages. So I think there are probably several who are working towards this. I think there's one which kind of currently lies between the north and the south who's working towards this. And there are probably several others, but yeah, I think it's quite a long, drawn-out process. Things move quite slowly. But, you know, people want to be sure that they're not making a mistake in the appellation authorities. So.
No, absolutely. I mean, they've been around. They've been around for like 50 years of the AOC system, so they only did a few key changes. And I mean, we're speaking about fluidity, but still, it's a quite pragmatic. It seems to be a quite pragmatic operation. And when you're talking about the south and the north, I mean, the Cote du Rhone appellation itself, it covers also the northern part as well. How does the Cote du Rhone operates in the northern part? Because
that's right. So I mentioned before about the appellation pyramid. So we have the AOC Cote du Rhone, AOC Cote du Rhone Village, and then the 22 named villages. So they all come before the crus at the top. So whether that's Lirac, Gigondas, Vaqueras. So almost all of those appellations at the base of the pyramid, so Cote du Rhone Village, the named villages, they're all in the Southern Rhone. So you can make Cote du Rhone in the Northern Rhone. And some people do, but it's extremely unusual. So if we're talking about Cote du Rhone, if we're talking about Cote du Rhone Village, especially Village and the named Village, we're always talking about the Southern Rhone. So there's one or two kind of well-known Cote du Rhones from the Northern Rhone. So Domaine Jamais make one. So they make a red Cote du Rhone and a white Cote du Rhone, which is very good. But they are very, very unusual.
Okay, so it's something just happens. So when we're talking about the unusually or there's something a bit unusual, what areas of the Rhone are you aside of the mainstream region? What area of the Rhone you're getting really excited about and you think people should get to know more?
Well, I think there's some of these kind of satellite areas which are a little bit less well known. So there are appellations such as Ventoux, Costières de Nîmes, Grignon-les-Adamars. So these are often, well, they're often very, very big, but some of them are also extremely small. But there are kind of 7 or 8, it depends how you count, but there are 7 or 8 of these kind of satellite, kind of so-called other Rhone Valley appellations. And often stylistically, they do things a little bit differently. They have a slightly different take on things. And often there's a lot of value to be found. So particularly in Ventoux, I think for me is one of the most exciting appellations in the Rhone Valley. It's also one of the biggest. So you have to be a little bit careful. It's one of those appellations where you can't just buy the appellation alone. You really have to know kind of which producers you're looking at as well. But there are certain terroirs within Ventoux, particularly as it kind of climbs up into the Dentelle de Montmirail next door to Gigondas, where there is some really exceptional terroirs. So there's some brilliant wines being made in Ventoux at the moment. Also in Costières de Nîmes, as I mentioned before. So Costières de Nîmes is it's very, very close to the Mediterranean. So it's basically as far south as you can get. So much lower in altitude, maritime influence, so cooling sea breezes. So although it's the most southerly appellation in the Rhone Valley, kind of strangely, it's not the hottest because you get these cooling sea breezes. So very good whites, very good reds, good rosés as well, and often in a slightly more kind of fluid, not quite so intense style, the red wines in particular. So I would take a look at those two, particularly if you're looking for value. I think there's some really good value wines.
And just a last question, the same question, but for the Cote du Rhone, the villages, which of the villages you getting really excited about the wines that are coming out? I know there is a lot of, you probably can't say all of them because probably they know all of, all of most of the producers. So, but just of the villages, which one are you would like to, you like to drink the most, or you like to taste or see where it's going?
And the thing is, among the 22 named villages, I think that yes, there are some who are kind of overperform. So just to name a few of those quickly. So Sablé is one. So in French, the word sable, it means sand. So it's quite a sandy terroir. It's right next door to Gigondas. And it makes wines with this kind of particular freshness and lightness and drinkability that I find very appealing. So Sablé is good. Another one is Massif du Chaux. So it's one of the more recent additions. I think they were promoted in about 2005 to one of the named villages. So Massif du Chaux, it's directly north of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. It's quite close to the river, but it's this big, huge, actually, kind of low-ish hill, almost completely covered in woods. So really good biodiversity, and it's quite a kind of wooded, natural, kind of shady environment. But a lot of limestone, a lot of sandstone, very good reds. And currently the appellation is only for red wines, but they do make some very good white wines there. But the style of Massif du Chaux for me is one that it's quite vibrant, it's quite spicy, quite kind of raspberry fruited. And those wines are quite distinctive, and that again, good value for money, quite distinctive, doing their own thing in quite a kind of spicy, drinkable, enjoyable style.
Nice. I remember, I think I tasted one of those two wines with you in the past, or some of this. It was really interesting, and I really think Cote du Rhone and the Southern Rhone is really an exciting area. It's quite difficult to get hold your hand around. There's a lot of different cogs moving together, and stylistically can become a bit tricky to sort of understand them all and differentiate it. But I think there's a lot of work there, and there's a lot of great wines outside not only the cruise, but also in the wider region of the Southern Rhone. I think it's really interesting. I do get quite a bit of wine from there because I kind of like to explore the region. Matt, thank you for this half an hour, 40 minutes together. If you have anything you wanted to add, or where people can get to you, where is the best place to see what you're doing with Cote du Rhone, with the Rhone wines?
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose I spend a lot of my time writing for Decanter at the moment. So I have a column on Decanter Premium, which is twice a month, almost always on the Rhone. So there's that. Also writing for the magazine. Where else can you find me? I do quite a lot of speaking about the Rhone in general, particularly in London, around England, and also occasionally in the south of France as well. And you can also find me on my website, which is www.mattwalls.co.uk, which is also where you can buy copies of my book.
Okay, your wonderful book, The Wines of Rhone. And also in the show notes, I'm going to put all the details and the name of the different villages. There's a lot of different details I'm going to show in the show notes and in the various social media posts. But thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Matty.
You have listened to the Looking Into Wine podcast on the Cote du Rhone and the Rhone wines with the author of the Wines of Rhone, Matt Walls. If you enjoyed this podcast, remember to subscribe and to tell your friends about the podcast. And you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, under the name Looking Into Wine or Mattia Scarpazza. The next episode will be on the sustainability research that has been taking place at the Instituto Rodanian for Inter-Rhone. You can find Looking Into Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Hope to see you soon. Editing and mastering from Tommaso Ascoli.